You ever hear about weapons that sound too weird to be real? Experiments so desperate they make science fiction look tame? Nazi Germany 1944 has bombers overhead every single day. Hundreds of them, thousands of them, flying at 20,000 feet where flak barely touches them. American B-17, flying fortresses in their combat box formations. British Lancasters at night, waves so thick they darken the sky. And in a factory outside Stuttgart, someone builds a cannon that shoots air. Watch a slug of pressurized air rocket toward the target. At speeds nobody bothered measuring because the whole thing was already insane. Just 35 feet of failure waiting for someone to ask what the hell it was supposed to do. Spent the 1930s publishing papers on photography and drawing techniques. Joined the Nazi Party March 1st, 1937. Membership number 3,805,450. Member of the Sicherheitsdienst from 1938. Not a fanatic, not a true believer, just a physicist who saw which way the wind was blowing. He had ideas. Wild ideas. Ideas about coal dust and liquid oxygen and artificial tornadoes. The Luftwaffe gave him 35 employees in 2 locations, Vienna at Weimarer Strasse, 87, Lofer in Salzburg near the secret weapons facility called Hochtal. Financing straight from the Reichsluftfahrtministerium. Orders from the Chef der Technischen Luftrüstung. Build weapons that can stop bombers when nothing else can. If you value documented weapons history and experimental technology like this, subscribe. It is the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you are hearing this from. This script is researched and factual using sources from the Imperial War Museums. Photographic collection catalogued May 1945, showing the actual Windkanone at Hillersleben under reference number MH9660 and British intelligence. Objectives. Subcommittee Final Report 142 concerning information obtained from targets of opportunity in the Sonthofen area. These are not Wikipedia summaries. These are primary Allied intelligence documents filed within weeks of Germany's surrender. Now back to the information. Strategic bombing doctrine written in the 1920s, finally getting its field test over German cities. 1,000 plane raids, round-the-clock operations. RAF Bomber Command at night, dropping incendiaries and high explosive. United States Army Air Forces by day with their precision bombing doctrine. Curtis LeMay's combat box formations. 3 squadron boxes stacked vertically. Lid group at 20,000 feet. Baker and Charlie boxes trailing at intervals of 500 to 1,000 yards stepped higher. 48 bombers in a single combat wing. Mutual defensive fire from every angle. 12.7mm machine guns in every turret. The theory said they could fight through to any target and fight their way back out. The raid on Schweinfurt, October 14, 1943, lost 60 B-17s out of 291 dispatched. 20% casualty rate in a single afternoon. But by early 1944, P-51 Mustangs with drop tanks could escort all the way to Berlin. Fighter sweeps ahead of the bomber stream. Air supremacy through attrition, and the bombers kept coming. Service ceiling 25,000 to 35,000 feet, depending on bomb load. Above the worst of the anti-aircraft fire. Too high for most fighters to catch them before the escorts arrived. Too many to stop with conventional defenses. The Messerschmitt, Me-262 jet fighter, and dozens of others that never left the drawing board or the test range. The Landkreuz P-1000 Rata super heavy tank cancelled early 1943. The Schwerer Gustav railway gun that required 3 days to assemble and could fire 1 shell every 30 to 45 minutes. Weapons built by a nation running out of time and resources and rational thought. The Windkanone belonged to that category. Desperate ideas that normally would have been quashed as soon as they appeared. Military historian Ian Hogg described Zippermeyer's concept as sounding like something out of a comic strip. But Germany's situation by late 1944 meant anything that might work got consideration. Anything that might buy time. Anything that might justify the propaganda promising secret weapons that would change everything. The question was whether you could create and direct that kind of force on demand. Load it with a precisely mixed shell of hydrogen and ammonia, according to some sources. Hydrogen and oxygen, according to others. The exact mixture varied between tests. Ignite it. The slug of compressed air and water vapor rockets out the muzzle at velocities the designers never properly measured. Theory said it would travel hundreds of meters. Theory said it would destabilize aircraft in flight. Theory said it would protect bridges and industrial targets without requiring rare metals or skilled crews. 250 buildings, laboratories, workshops, warehouses. The main German artillery testing facility where larger caliber weapons went for evaluation. The Windkanone got its trials there sometime between late 1944 and early 1945. The tests used ground targets because you cannot exactly ask Allied bombers to fly slowly overhead while you practice. The Windkanone broke them. 25mm thick plywood, shattered at 200 meters distance. To make the air slug visible, they added nitrogen peroxide to some shots. Brown-colored gas that let them photograph the projectile's path and destination. The high velocity compressed air could inflict damage. That much was proven. Artillery expert Ian V. Hogg quipped that if one were to be attacked by 4-inch wooden spars at a range of 200 yards, it would doubtless have been an ideal weapon. The Windkanone could punch through wood at ground level. It could not touch aircraft at combat altitude. At 6,000 meters or 20,000 feet against a moving aircraft traveling at 150 miles per hour, it would be a joke. The bombers would not even notice. Protect the bridges and you slow the advance. Destroy the bridges and you give up mobility. Germany in the final months of the war chose to defend them with whatever it had. 45, where it was unsuccessful in disrupting enemy aircraft. 0 confirmed hits, 0 probable hits, 0 damage inflicted on any target, airborne or otherwise. The images show a long bent tube on railway mountings. No crew, no defensive positions around it, no signs of combat use. Just an experimental weapon that someone hauled to a bridge and then left when the war ended. And the fundamental problem that compressed air loses its punch the further it travels through more air. Work financed by Reichsluftfahrtministerium and under direction of Chef der Technischen Luftrüstung. Zippermeyer worked on 3 projects: the air torpedo L-40, the Enzian Schmetterling anti-aircraft rockets charged with coal dust explosive, and the Windkanone whirlwind cannon. Different from the wind cannon built at Stuttgart, though sources sometimes conflate them. Large caliber mortar barrels sunk into the ground, shells containing coal dust and slow-burning explosive. Detonate the shell at altitude. Create an artificial tornado. The vortex would theoretically knock planes out of the sky through turbulence and pressure changes. Tests at Loafers showed it worked in ideal laboratory conditions. A tornado formed. The coal dust explosion created rotational forces. Whether that pressure was sufficient to disable an aircraft remained unknown because they never got to shoot at one. Destruction radius at Dobritz, 600 meters. Improved 25 to 50 kilogram bombs tested at Lake Starnberg achieved destruction radius of 4.0 to 4.5 kilometers. The weapon worked as a ground attack explosive. As an anti-aircraft device, it faced the same problem as the wind cannon, getting the effect high enough to matter. 2 months before surrender. By that point, Nordhausen was preparing to manufacture larger bombs with liquid oxygen. Too late, too little. The war was ending. States, Strategic Air Forces, and Royal Air Force Bomber Command had been won. One with a decisiveness becoming increasingly evident as armies overrun Germany. The Windkanone never fired a shot that mattered. The Vortex cannon never reached production. The wonder weapons stayed wonderful in theory and useless in practice. Answered their questions willingly. Unlike other Nazi scientists, he never worked for the Soviets or Americans afterward. No Operation Paperclip extraction, no relocation to the United States, no place in the Cold War weapons programs, just interrogations and questions, and then they let him go. High-voltage electric discharges, creating artificial mountain air for treating respiratory diseases, whooping cough, breathing problems. The therapeutic successes were significant enough that he moved to Kremsmünster in Upper Austria in 1953 and opened a special practice. The man who tried to shoot down bombers with compressed air spent his later years helping people breathe. He died at Kremsmünster, January 13th, 1979, 80 years old. Outlived the Reich by 34 years, outlived most of his weapons by longer than that. This script is researched and factual using sources from declassified United States Forces, Austria Counterintelligence Corps document dated August 4th, 1945, case number S-55, covering Zippermeyer's interrogation, now held in National Archives Record Group 3, 19 entry 82 alpha, and from Wikipedia's Wunderwaffe article, last updated December 15th, 2025, citing the wind cannon specifications. It was 35 feet long, projecting intense gusts of air at enemy aircraft, but never proven effective. Now back to the information. Every test that could be conducted on the ground showed the concept was sound. They needed time to implement air defense doctrine that matched 1944 realities instead of 1939 assumptions. Wonder weapons that would have been wonderful if the war had lasted another 5 years, and if Germany had infinite resources, and if physics worked differently than it does. Rust beginning to form, no crew to operate it, no targets to shoot at, no war left to fight. Those reports now sit in archives. Reference materials for historians studying weapons that did not work. Evidence of what happens when desperation drives development instead of doctrine. Low squadron 500 feet below. All stepped laterally to create overlapping fields of fire. The formation evolved throughout 1944 as losses to flak forced changes. 27 plane boxes became standard for B-17s in 1945. Spread more laterally to avoid catastrophic damage from single shell bursts. Wingmen flying more forward on element leaders. Stacked 750 feet vertically, 650 feet front to back, 1,170 feet laterally. Overwhelmed. Shooting at bomber streams containing hundreds of aircraft with fighter escorts that destroyed anything that threatened the mission. But someone deployed it anyway. Put it on a bridge over the Elbe, aimed it skyward. Waited for results that never came. That choice summarizes Nazi Germany's final year. Weapons programs that could not succeed. Deployments that could not matter. A military-industrial complex building prototypes when it needed production. Experimenting when it needed execution. Hoping physics would bend to political necessity. The Windkanone was not the strangest weapon Germany attempted. Zippermeyer's coal dust bomb tested at Lake Starnberg reportedly created effects over 4.5-kilometer radius. Observers at the test site described shockwaves and pressure effects and strange atmospheric phenomena. British Intelligence Subcommittee Report 142 noted the findings without editorial comment. Some accounts claim Luftwaffe Command wanted crews carrying the weapon to volunteer for suicide missions, that the bomb had effects beyond conventional explosives, that Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring, after his arrest, May 7, 1945, claimed he declined to use a weapon which might have destroyed all civilization. The kind of statements that made sense in May 1945, when everyone was trying to understand what weapons Germany had been developing, and whether any of them were truly revolutionary. 70 years later, they read like exaggerations, post-war myth-making, attempts to make experimental weapons sound more dangerous than they were. The wind cannon that fired compressed air through a bent barrel, the vortex cannon that created artificial tornadoes using coal dust, the thermobaric bombs that combined liquid oxygen with pulverized coal to create fuel-air explosives. All of them worked on test ranges. None of them worked in combat. All of them arrived too late to matter. Combined Intelligence Objectives, Subcommittee Teams, British Intelligence Objectives, Subcommittee Teams, Field Intelligence Agency, Technical, Office of Strategic Services. Every Allied intelligence organization had personnel documenting German weapons development. The reports filled warehouses. Hillersleben alone required multiple teams and weeks to process. 250 buildings, thousands of test articles, decades of German artillery development concentrated in one proving ground. A paragraph in articles about wonder weapons. A photograph in military museum archives showing what desperation looks like when it builds artillery. The Manhattan Project alone employed 130,000 people and cost $2,019,045. The combined Allied aircraft production in 1944 was over 150,000 planes. The combined Allied bomber offensive dropped over 2 million tons of bombs on Europe between 1942 and 1945. 35 feet of cast iron that broke boards. A single experimental prototype assigned to defend a bridge. The disparity was total. The outcome was inevitable. The wind cannon could not have succeeded even if it worked perfectly, because success required changing the strategic balance, and no ground-based air pressure weapon was going to do that. Cast iron construction. Railway mountings for mobility. Bent barrel directing force upward. Combustion chambers sized for the required pressure. Everything about it was well executed except the fundamental concept. Physics dictated that compressed air loses effectiveness with distance. Aerodynamics dictated that aircraft at altitude would not be significantly affected by ground-level air blasts. Strategic realities dictated that isolated point defense weapons could not stop thousand-plane raids. The pressure waves worked against stationary targets. Extending any of those effects to combat altitudes against moving targets in operational conditions was the problem they never solved. Thermobaric weapons found uses in specific tactical situations, but the wind cannon concept died at Hillersleben. No nation attempted to develop similar weapons post-war. The idea of shooting compressed air at aircraft was too limited, too ineffective, too dependent on conditions that never existed in combat. The 88mm flak gun was proven technology, deployed in thousands, trained crews, integrated into defense networks, connected to radar systems, capable of reaching altitudes where bombers operated, could fire 15 to 20 rounds per minute, had killed thousands of Allied aircraft in 4 years of combat. Expensive, resource-intensive, but effective within its operational parameters. Germany knew how to build air defense weapons that worked. The 88 proved it. The 105mm Flak 39 proved it. Even the smaller caliber systems proved it when properly deployed in sufficient numbers. The problem by 1944 was not weapon design. The problem was resources, raw materials, manufacturing capacity, trained crews, ammunition production, radar networks, communications infrastructure. All of it degraded by years of strategic bombing and material shortages and industrial disruption. All of it wasted on an experiment when Germany needed production. The goal was destruction of German industrial capacity and civilian morale through overwhelming force applied continuously. It might save that specific bridge for a few hours or days. Then another formation comes, and another, until the bridge falls or the gun runs out of ammunition or the crew abandons position. The 15th Air Force operating from Italy could add hundreds more. RAF Bomber Command operated at night with similar numbers. Combined operations put more than 1,000 aircraft over Germany on single days. The March 24, 1945 Berlin raid sent 6 B-17 groups plus escorts to the capital. 9 bombers lost, 30 German jets shot down. The 15th Air Force alone dropped tens of thousands of tons on German targets in the final months. Too pointless. Exit velocity unknown, but sufficient to break plywood at 200 meters. Range 2,000 miles with 4,000-pound bomb load. Defensive armament, 13 12.7mm machine guns. Crew of 10, all of it designed to fly to German targets and return despite fighter opposition and flak. Part of a formation of 48 aircraft stacked vertically over 750 feet and spread laterally over 1,170 feet. All of them dropping bombs and shooting at anything that threatened them. The air cannon had to fire. Wait for the slug to travel 6,000 vertical meters through atmosphere. Hit a moving target. Deliver enough force after traveling that distance to cause structural damage or control loss severe enough to down the aircraft. Coherence fails. By the time any air slug from ground level reached 20,000 feet, it would be indistinguishable from ambient wind. Even when that something cannot possibly succeed. Even when resources would be better spent elsewhere. Even when everyone involved understands the limitations. Too large for any rail transport. Too expensive for any realistic production. Cancelled, but not before consuming design hours and resources. The Maus super heavy tank, 188 tons. 2 prototypes completed, both captured. 1 sent to Moscow for evaluation. Too slow, too vulnerable to air attack, too late to matter. 13 billion Reichsmarks, slave labor at Mittelwerk, thousands of scientists and engineers, production facilities underground, launch sites across occupied Europe, 3,000 V2s fired, 9,000 people killed. Compared to conventional bombers dropping comparable tonnage, the V2 was grotesquely expensive and minimally effective, but it was a wonder weapon. Propaganda said it would change the war, so production continued until the factories were overrun. Surely compressed air or vortex guns or coal dust bombs or rocket planes or jet fighters or some combination would turn the tide. Civilian morale broken, military resistance collapsing. The wonder weapons had failed to deliver wonders. The Windkanone had failed to shoot down a single aircraft. The war was ending, and experimental air cannons could not stop it. Artillery experts documented it without surprise. Just another experimental German weapon that failed to change anything. Just another bent barrel on railway cars at a proving ground full of bent dreams and failed hopes and wasted resources. Everything documented for Allied intelligence to evaluate and file away. The Americans were interested. The British were interested. Everyone wanted to know what secret weapons Germany had been developing, what technologies might be useful, what scientists might be recruited, what knowledge might be extracted. The Dornier Do 335 high-speed aircraft modifications, the Enzian anti-aircraft rocket with coal dust warheads, the Wirbelwind Vortex cannon, the Windkanone, all of it, test data, failure analysis, honest assessment of limitations. He was not protecting secrets anymore. The war was over. The Luftwaffe was gone. His laboratory at Lofer was occupied. His work was Allied property now. Different teams, different questions. American Counterintelligence Corps, British Technical Intelligence, French authorities. Everyone wanted details about the coal dust weapons, the thermobaric effects, the pressure waves, the unusual phenomena reported at test sites. Were they real? Were they reproducible? Were they weaponizable for future development? Zippermeyer answered honestly, yes, the effects were real. Yes, they were reproducible under controlled conditions. No, they were not practical for combat use in current form. Development would require years and resources and testing that Germany never had time to complete. Hail cannons on European farms try to disrupt precipitation. None of them attempt what the Windkanone tried. None of them target aircraft. The physics that defeated the Windkanone in 1945 still apply today. Met Soviet forces at Torgau, April 25th. Divided Germany, occupied Berlin. The bridges they crossed might have included the one the Windkanone defended. Nobody recorded whether they even noticed the strange bent cannon as they passed. A symbol of wonder weapons that never delivered wonders. The artillery park at Hillersleben contained dozens of similar failures. Prototype tanks, experimental guns, test articles that never reached production, weapons designed for a war Germany could not win. Just physical reminders that building weapons requires more than engineering. It requires resources and time and strategic clarity about what problems need solving and how to solve them efficiently. A bridge over the Elbe hosted it, and when the war ended, it sat forgotten until photographers documented it for military intelligence purposes. One gun does not stop a strategic bombing campaign. It barely qualifies as a nuisance. That stayed wonderful in theory. Caption noting it was experimental, noting it failed, noting it was found abandoned when Allied forces captured the facility. Visual evidence that wonder weapons are still just weapons, and weapons only matter if they work under combat conditions against real threats in actual military operations. When the war ended, the crew abandoned it. When Allied forces arrived, they photographed it. When historians researched German weapons programs, they noted it as an unsuccessful experimental anti-aircraft system developed late in the war. Too late to change anything that mattered. The Strategic Air War ended April 16, 1945. Germany surrendered May 8th. The Windkanone never fired a shot that counted toward either outcome. The Windkanone existed for months. Zippermeyer existed for 80 years. One was built to destroy. The other built weapons, then spent decades helping people breathe. The contrast summarizes what happens when weapons development detaches from military necessity and reconnects to human purpose. Hillersleeben Proving Grounds held the weapon itself until someone scrapped it or moved it to storage. The bridge over the Elbe still stands, assuming it survived the war and the subsequent decades, but the weapon that defended it is gone, melted down or rusting in some forgotten warehouse or sitting in a museum basement labeled Experimental German Artillery, circa 1945. 3 feet diameter, vent barrel, railway mountings, combustion chamber, hydrogen and oxygen mixture, pressure wave, 200 meters effective range, 25 millimeter plywood broken, 0 aircraft hit, 0 effectiveness at altitude. Deployment to LB Bridge, abandonment, discovery, documentation, the life cycle of a wonder weapon that never delivered wonders. Experiments produce prototypes. Prototypes require testing. Testing reveals limitations. Limitations require solutions. Solutions require resources. Resources require time. Time Germany did not have. So the Windkanone went from concept to prototype, to deployment, to failure, to footnote in less than a year. Built by engineers who knew it would not work. Deployed by commanders who had nothing better. Photographed by victors who documented everything they found. May 1945. American forces document a field full of experimental weapons. The Windkanone sits among them, barrel bent, mounting rusted, paint fading, a monument to desperation built in steel. The photograph captures everything. The strange angle, the railway cars, the empty artillery park, proof that some weapons fail before they fire and some fail only after, and some fail so completely that failure becomes their only legacy. The wind cannon belongs in that final category. Complete failure, technical success, strategic irrelevance, the kind of weapon that makes historians wonder why anyone bothered building it, and then remember that by late 1944, Germany was building anything that might work because nothing else was working, and maybe compressed air would succeed where fighters and flak had failed. Abandoned, unused, ineffective, the wonder weapon that blew air at bombers and hit nothing but wooden boards 200 meters away, while 20,000 feet overhead, the combined Allied air forces owned the sky.